Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're diving into one of my favorite topics, which is the British monarchy. It's probably right up there with U.S. presidents and the American Civil War in terms of the topics that I've spent the most time reading about, studying about, being interested in. And this is from the channel Spectrum, which has about 76,000 subscribers. I'm not sure that we've ever done a reaction to him before. If so, I don't remember, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen at some point. And I did myself way back when we had about 95,000 subscribers. This was about 3 years ago. I did my own live stream where I did a tier ranking of the monarchs since 1066. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at Spectrum's video. He ranked them from worst to best. And then as we talk about these folks that he's talking about, we'll try to go a little more in depth on the topic, talk about their positives and negatives of each one of these monarchs, and then I will share my own ranking. I went back and watched my live stream and made a list of where I ranked them. Now, there's a couple that I probably would change in the last 3 years from where I ranked them ever so slightly, but I'll at least share where I ranked them at the time and see how it compares to his list. I'll also put a link in there in the description, not only to his original content so you can check out his channel, but also to my stream from 3 years ago where I did the tier ranking and spent about an hour and a half talking about all of these folks in a little more detail. Let's dive into this one.
Well, here we go again. And this time it's the English kings from worst to best. This time we will be including an actual tier list along with the actual positions, so you can get an actual idea on how good or bad they were, given there's 56 monarchs on this list, and as such, I will be going through them a little faster than usual.
So I didn't do 56 on my list. I started in 1066 with William the Conqueror. Just seemed like a natural starting point, but I'm guessing he's going all the way back to all the kings who were king over all of England. So there'll be some like the Anglo-Saxon kings or some of the Danish kings that I didn't mention. I also didn't rank a few that really just don't have a lot of stuff to rank, like Lady Jane Grey, who was monarch for 9 days, and folks like Edward V, who really just never had a chance to even be on the throne on his own.
This will go from Alfred the Great to George VI.
Alfred the Great
Queen Elizabeth II
wasn't really king of England. England didn't exist yet, but all right.
Second will not be considered because last time I checked, literally last Monday, as that was the time I was writing this, she was alive and therefore her reign hadn't finished yet.
Not anymore.
Now, here we go. By the way, consider subscribing. 56, John Lackland.
Yeah.
AKA the guy so incompetent he had to sign the Magna Carta. Not did. Had. Lost lands in France, gave away much of his realm to the Pope, faced a huge rebellion, faced a civil war, faced a war with France. To put it bluntly, he was just incompetent, and he didn't even compensate that with a good personality. There's far more to indicate he was personally unpleasant. There's other kings I thought for the bottom position, but John was literally the first to come in mind, though I will say tales of his tyranny have been greatly exaggerated. 55.
Anything like that always gets exaggerated. Now, everything he said about John's true. There's a reason why there hasn't been another King John. John was so bad that at the very end of his reign, the barons in England actually invited a French member of the French royal family to come take the throne. So you very briefly had a French king that, as he's arriving to be made king, John dies, and so then his son Henry gets to take the throne, and so they kind of brush it under the rug that they had a Frenchman in town to be made king. But yeah, I wouldn't say, oh, John had to sign Magna Carta, so that makes him bad. And maybe the best thing that came out of John's reign was that he signed Magna Carta, because that led to many of the liberties that Englishmen would enjoy, and obviously it weakened the monarchy. But the way I ranked my English monarchs was based on whether or not I thought they were a net positive for their own country. And it's hard to argue that John was a net positive for his country. I think you could probably argue that Edward II and Richard II could be in that same conversation for the worst, but I definitely will not dispute his ranking, John. John's definitely one of the ones that I have in my F tier.
5, Richard II.
Along with
More
Richard.
competent than John, for sure, but I wouldn't describe him as anything but an overgrown child who throws temper tantrums over the slightest issue.
Fair.
His tendency to alienate his inferiors, often for no decent reason whatsoever, is what ended up having him overthrown by his cousin. 54, Edward.
So Richard the Second is the one who comes to the throne in the midst of the time that's going to lead into the Wars of the Roses, because him being overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke is what creates these separate houses of York and Lancaster that are going to battle it out for the throne a few decades later. Because Henry Bolingbroke was not next in line to the throne after Richard. He took the throne by right of conquest, and in the process usurped it from several other people who were ahead of him in the line of succession. But Richard comes to the throne after the long and relatively successful reign of one of the best English kings in Edward III, who's one of my S tier. Edward III is his grandfather. His father was the Black Prince. If you've seen the movie A Knight's Tale, you see James Purefoy plays the Black Prince in there. Black Prince dies a year before his father, Edward III, probably would have been a good king, and leaves his child son, Richard, on the throne. And children coming to the throne never ends particularly well. In fact, if you look at the list of some of the worst monarchs on this list, several of them come to the throne as children.
II. He pissed off both the French and his nobility so much, both parties actually allied against him.
Yep.
Including his own wife.
Yep.
That is incredible. The only one not against him was his best friend, who may have been his lover,
Piers
though
Gaveston.
that's pure speculation. 53.
So, fictionalized version of him in the movie Braveheart. You see King Edward I throw Piers Gaveston out, or the guy they call Piers, out a window. That's not what happened, but yeah, Edward II's major downfall was him playing favorites with Piers Gaveston. Whether he was his lover or just a friend that he lavished way too much favor on, either way, it screwed his reign big time. And he absolutely is an F tier. So we're 3 for 3 so far, all 3. And actually, he's getting into Henry VI. All 4 of those guys are ones I had in my F tier at the bottom.
Henry VI. We have been cursed. God have mercy on us all. Those who get it will. This man was little more than a puppet whose weakness would lead to the Wars of the Roses. Not much more I can say. 50.
So when I mentioned that Henry IV usurped the throne from Richard II, his son is Henry V, who we remember as one of the great kings. Wins the Battle of Agincourt, pretty much sews up the 100 Years' War, and is in position to become king of both England and France, which France was claimed by Henry V, and pretty strong claim. And had Henry V not died and left his 9-month-old son Henry VI on the throne, England and France probably do stay united under one crown for at least a while. But Henry VI comes to the throne at 9 months old. And even when he becomes an adult, he's dealing with some severe mental illness, and he's basically a puppet who's run by his advisors and his wife, and absolutely one of the worst kings.
52. Stephen of Blois. His reign was initially good, then everything just sort of fell apart. Specifically, a massive Welsh revolt alongside a civil war against his own cousin and rival, Empress Matilda, who, by the way, is not on this list. By the end, Stephen had lost control of much of England.
I don't have Matilda on my list either, but she's called Empress Matilda because she was for a time married to the Holy Roman Emperor. She later on marries the Count of Anjou, Geoffrey Plantagenet, and that's where you get the Plantagenet dynasty. They never called themselves that. They were the Angevins from Anjou, but Plantagenet was a nickname for Geoffrey, and it got passed down. Stephen is also in my F tier. So every one of these guys is an F tier for me. So is Richard III. So I'm really happy to see that so far his list is really, really similar to my own. I didn't actually rank them in specific order, but all of these have been F tiers.
51. Richard III. When it comes to administration, he was, for the most part, alright.
Yeah, true.
Politically, however, a disaster. He definitely murdered the princes in the tower. I say it
I won't go that far.
Without evidence, but come on, we're all adults here.
Here's the thing. it's been fed into our collective consciousness because of people like Shakespeare that Richard III was an evil tyrant with a hunchback. He did have scoliosis, we know now, from when his body was found. But Richard III is painted as this tyrant who usurped the throne, which he did, from his nephew, Edward V. Edward V and his brother, Richard, the Duke of York, are sent to the Tower. They slowly start being seen less and less until they're not seen at all. The assumption is Richard had them offed. But there's an argument to be made that it was done on behalf of Henry Tudor. I'm not saying Henry Tudor ordered it. I'm saying somebody did it on his behalf. I'm not saying Richard isn't guilty. But they did, I think it was back in the 80s or early 90s, they did a trial on TV. I think it was hosted by Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, which is what Richard's title was, Richard III's title was, and now the Duke of Gloucester is also named Richard. He's a cousin of the Queen, or of King Charles now. And the jury in that case decided that there was not enough evidence to convict Richard and found him not guilty. I think there's plausible speculation about that. I think there's reasonable doubt. I'm not saying he didn't do it, but I'm not going to say he definitely did do it.
Most of the people watching anyway. When you murder and usurp the rightful king, it's hard for people to like you, regardless of your awesome administrative abilities.
The argument was that Edward was not the rightful king, that his parents' marriage had been invalid, and it probably was. This is a long story, but basically at that time, if you entered into what was called like a pre-contract of marriage, it basically was the same thing as a marriage. It was kind of like a betrothal, which if you read in the Bible, it talks about how Joseph and Mary were betrothed when she finds out she's going to have the child, the Son of God, and it says that Joseph had in mind to divorce her quietly. Well, if they weren't married and they were only betrothed, why need a divorce? Well, because it was a legal contract and you needed a divorce to get out of that. And so Edward IV, who was the father of Edward V and the brother of Richard III, was known to make promises to women to get him into bed. He was a bit of a player, even after he got married to Elizabeth Woodville. And at one point, he entered into a contract for marriage with this woman named Eleanor Butler. He never married her, but he may have just done it to get her in bed. Then he marries Elizabeth Woodville, has all these kids, and what Richard gets Parliament to do is to declare that Edward V is actually an illegitimate child because his parents were never legally married, because his father was never let out of that contract with Eleanor Butler. So he didn't just usurp the rightful king and then have him murdered. He did go through the legal process to do it, to usurp him.
The trumped-up charges on your political enemies didn't help either. 50, Mary I.
Also in my F tier, let's see, we're only ones we're missing in my F tier, Charles I and James II, and we'll be complete.
May recognize
and
her
Edward
as
VIII.
Bloody Mary. Catholic, aligned with Spain, persecuted Protestants, short reign. Yeah, you can see why the English hate her. In her defense, she's so low precisely because she didn't reign long enough to have England return to
5
Catholicism.
years.
Had she, and she would probably be much higher.
And technically, they actually kind of list her husband, Philip, who was the King of Spain, as King of England. It's kind of a weird arrangement that they had, because you had this very rare scenario where you have the monarch of England marrying the monarch of Spain. Often you married members of the royal family, but not a monarch level. And so they're kind of jointly ruling England in kind of a weird way.
49, Charles I. Inherited the throne, tried to rule like an absolute monarch, and even after being imprisoned...
in a time when England no longer really had the freedom of an absolute monarchy. I think Henry VIII is probably the last one that legit rules like an absolute monarch.
Rejected a constitutional monarchy. He was executed for his efforts. 48, James II.
Yep. All right, so if we throw Edward VIII in there, all of my F tiers will be right in a row at the bottom.
Short reign is mostly due to his attempts at initiating a Catholic dynasty at a time Protestantism had pretty much become a part of the character of the English.
James II is the classic example of not reading the room. not reading the political landscape and just doing what you think you should do because you're the king and you can do what you want. And there was no reason for him to have lost his throne, but he just, like Richard II, just failed miserably, and Edward II too, to read the room and to understand, and just had no political savvy at all, and it cost him his throne.
He was allowed to be king despite being a Catholic due to personal tolerance. This did not mean the English were tolerant of Catholicism in general. Furthermore, he tried imposing his measures by decree, ignoring Parliament. He was understandably removed.
So he gets replaced then by William and Mary, who are both grandchildren of a previous English monarch. And they kind of, again, jointly rule, but in that case, they both kind of had their own claim to the throne anyway, and they call it the Glorious Revolution. Even though there was no bloodshed when they came to the throne, that doesn't mean there wasn't bloodshed, because there was a lot of bloodshed. This is when you have the Jacobite rebellions in the north up in Scotland, and a lot of bloodshed, and you eventually have things like Culloden, all because of William and Mary coming to the throne and the aftermath of that for generations. All right, Edward VIII. So my entire F tier list is out there now. So then we'll go to my D tier, which would be William II, Richard I, Edward VI, George I, and George IV. Though I'm guessing, like a lot of people, he's not going to put Richard the Lionheart that low.
47. Edward VIII. Some say he sympathized with the Third Reich. I say, considering he brought a constitutional crisis because he couldn't keep it in his pants, he deserves to be this low. 46.
It wasn't so much that he couldn't keep it in his pants as that he insisted on marrying the person with whom he couldn't keep it in his pants. And listen, it's easy to judge him, especially in light of his brother, because his brother was the polar opposite, right? A guy all about duty, all about setting yourself aside for the good of the crown. And Edward just did. He kind of followed his passion and followed his love. I think a regular person can't really argue with that. You know, it's tough to think you couldn't marry the person you wanted to be with. And he made a decision. So I'm not going to fault him too much for that, but strictly in judging him as a monarch, it was a disaster. And he has to be F. So like I said, William II, William Rufus, this is the son of William the Conqueror, one of my D tiers. So far, we are right in lockstep with each other.
William Rufus. Stupid name, stupid ruler. If you're going to rule, never piss off those who play a role in ruling the kingdom. 45.
So William Rufus dies of a hunting accident. Might well have been an assassination. We'll never know for sure.
5. Hedwig.
Okay, I didn't
Hedwig.
rank him.
Short reign marked by disputes with nobility and clergy. The most interesting thing about his reign is his name. 44. George I. Hated for being too German. It was
not too German, he was German. He spoke German, he didn't speak English. Not his fault. It was the fact that they passed a law in the UK. Well, at this time it's still England and Scotland separately. They haven't... Wait, no, this is just after the Union. So Great Britain now. We're talking about Great Britain. That basically bypassed anyone who was Catholic for the throne. And so Georg of Hanover, the Prince Elector of Hanover, is next in line.
Under his reign, Britain transitioned from a powerful monarchy to the modern prime minister system it exists today. It was Walpole. Of course it was.
If you know, you know. But no, Robert Walpole becomes the first prime minister in large part because of the fact that you've got a German-speaking monarch who basically just wants to be back in Germany, in Hanover. And that's where he's actually buried. He didn't speak a word of English and basically needed somebody to kind of exercise authority on his behalf, and that's where you develop the prime minister.
43. Edred.
Anglo-Saxon names are fun.
Even if in battle he was consistently defeated by others. It's genuinely difficult to judge him. 42. Sweyn
Sven.
Probably ranks higher in the list of Danish kings. As for this list, however, due to his short reign, he's just kind of there. 41. Arthur Canute. See Sweyn because what I said about him essentially applies to Arthur Canute. 40. Harold Harefoot.
So you see a bunch of monarchs here in this period right before William the Conqueror.
Portrayed pretty poorly. Also brief reign, so ultimately not much to say about this one. 39. Richard.
Nice. I'm starting to think like he copied my list. Like, seriously. I mean, almost exactly in order. Every one of my F tiers. Now we've done my D tiers. William II, Richard I, George I are all my D tiers. So if he adds Edward VI, which, I don't know, maybe he goes different with Edward VI. Edward VI and George IV are my only other D tiers.
The Lionheart. That's right. The guy with maybe the
terrible
coolest
for
cognomen
England.
is this low on the list. But is it really that surprising? He only spent 6 months, maybe even less than that, in England. Ultimately, he was really more of a general than an actual king. In his reign, there's almost no ruling whatsoever.
No, he's barely in the country. He gets himself captured on the way back from one of the crusades, and they basically have to bankrupt the country to pay his ransom. He doesn't produce an heir, and so then leaves England with his brother John, who was awful. There's really very little good to say about Richard when it comes to the country he was actually the king of. All right.
38.
Edward VI. All right. That's not Edward VI, though. Edward VI died at 15. He was the son of Henry VIII. That is not Edward VI. Oh, there he is. Oh, we were looking at the wrong guy. That's why.
His reign was pretty short and also pretty tumultuous.
So why? Whose picture was that? And why are we showing it?
In his reign, there's almost no ruling whatsoever.
That's one of the Stuarts.
Edward VI. His reign was pretty short and also pretty tumultuous. He never really ruled the country, as he became the king at the young age of 9 and would kick the bucket 6 years later, before he really picked up the pieces of the kingdom himself, as, naturally, a regency council ruled over him. 37.
Regency council that was run by his uncle, who ended up being executed for treason. He was the son of Jane Seymour. Two of his uncles, Edward and Thomas, both got executed during his reign, or one during his reign and one just after. But yeah, there's not a lot good that goes on. So there's George IV. So that's my entire D tier list. If he goes through my C tier next without any breaks in it, I'm going to be convinced that he copied from me.
7. George IV. He was kind of hated by the people, mostly because of his poor relations with his parents and wife, and also because of his extravagance.
Now, George IV is interesting, because even though he's only king from 1820 to 1830, he was Prince Regent before that. He's the son of George III. So he had to reign as Prince Regent during his father's madness.
Wouldn't be missed. 36.
Ethelred.
The man at the top of the D tier. Mostly because, as the name implies, he just wasn't ready to deal with all the mess happening throughout his reign. After years of peace, the Danish began heavily raiding the coastlines, culminating in an invasion which saw Ethelred flee to Normandy.
So before we even get into this, because I'm starting to get a little bit of a complex about how perfectly our rankings line up, I'm going to read out my C tier and see how it matches up. I've got Henry III, Henry IV, Edward IV, Henry VII, Charles II, George II, William IV, Edward VII. All right, here we go.
Only to come back when King Swine died. 35. Edward V. There are two monarchs on the question mark tier.
Yeah, I didn't rank Edward V.
This is because they were so young and their nominal rule was so brief, I can't quite judge them. As a result, they sit automatically between D and C tier. This is the first one. 34. Edward the Martyr. This is the other monarch sitting between D and C tier. Let's move on. 33. Charles II. Apparently pretty popular in England, despite dissolving the English Parliament at one point, which, given he spent much of his reign in conflict with said institution, isn't that surprising.
I mean, as did his father, right? The Charleses don't have a great track record, so hopefully Charles III works out better. William IV. All right, we are 2 for 2 on C tier now.
32. William IV. Not much to say about this one, to be honest. His brief reign was just before victorious and saw several reforms, most notably the abolition of slavery, but it's not like he made all of those reforms himself.
Nah, that was Parliament. That was guys like William Wilberforce who were behind that. William gave his assent to those things, obviously. And like his brother George IV, left no legitimate descendants. So that brings us Victoria after him.
It's a bit difficult to judge figureheads. 31. George II. Again, another figurehead. He is noteworthy.
Seriously, he's got to disagree with me on at least one of these.
For being the last British monarch to lead an army in battle. Specifically, he led his forces at the Battle of Dettingen in the War of Austrian Succession. 30. Edward IV. With the exception of needlessly pissing off his greatest advisor, he was mostly okay.
What he's talking about there is Edward IV. He basically ends the Wars of the Roses, at least for a while, when he becomes king in the 1460s. His father had been Duke of York and had died during the Wars of the Roses. Edward becomes king, and his greatest advisor is the guy that they know as the Kingmaker. And he's the Earl of Warwick. And he ticks him off because he marries this widow of a Lancastrian, Elizabeth Woodville, who was beautiful, but a commoner. And eventually the Kingmaker is going to go to the other side and actually fight for the Lancastrian side because of it.
I mean, he did have to put down said advisor, twice, but I can't really say he was good or terrible, just somewhere in between. 29. Edmund I. Historians view Edmund I wildly. He can be seen as a great king and as a terrible one, which makes me think he's probably somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's
28.
fair.
Edward VII. Regarded...
Seriously, every one of these has been the exact same tier as mine. I keep saying that, but it's true. So this is a really cool picture here because you got George V on the left with his father, Edward VII on the right. And if you've ever seen pictures of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, you see the similarities, and that's because George V and Nicholas II, their mothers were sisters.
As the first truly constitutional monarch by the British. Another figurehead, and one not particularly noticeable at that. 22nd, Henry III. Given his rather long reign, he was very likely not an absolute disaster.
No, he was solid. I think one of the big drawbacks to him, of course, is the whole, well, I'm sure he'll talk about it.
That being said, he did have some major failings, most notably his naivete and inability to make realistic reforms on the kingdom.
Yeah.
26th, Henry IV. Overthrew his cousin to become king. After said cousin, one Richard II proved to be a disaster. That little action would later cause the Wars of the Roses, but we can't really blame him for that. His reign was spent mostly putting down rebellions.
I mean, we can blame him for that, and he did spend most of his time putting down rebellions. But I think he saw a power vacuum with Richard II. He saw how bad things were going, figured it couldn't get any worse. You could say that it was all about ambition and seeing an opportunity to take the throne for himself, but he might have also argued that he was doing what was best for the kingdom.
25. Edmund Ironside. I'll admit it, the cognomen may have skewed my opinion a little bit.
Yeah, he's only king for 1 year, and you've already told us that other guys that reigned for 2 or 3 years, it was too short to really judge.
Ironside just sounds cool. Sadly, he may have had the most undignified death out of all the kings of England.
Yeah.
Stabbed while taking a dump, though that may be hearsay. 24. Henry VII. At the top of C tier we have Henry VII, the winner of the Wars of the Roses and the first of the Tudor dynasty. I liked his way of ruling. Get the throne, do everything to stay on it, and slowly improve the country.
Basically, very similar to Henry IV, who was the first Lancastrian king, down to the last Lancastrian kings, who Henry VII was the only Lancastrian claimant that was left at the end of the Wars of the Roses, and his claim to the throne was super weak, but again, it was by right of conquest. He defeats Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. And he doesn't necessarily do anything horrible. He's not great, but anytime you come in after decades of instability, you're going to have an uphill battle. And by and large, he brought a lot of stability to the kingdom and passed a relatively stable throne to his son, Henry VIII.
23. George III. Not as terrible as typically...
Okay, so let's get into my B tier now. All of his F, D, and C tiers are right in my same order. My B tiers are George III, George V, Anne, James I, Henry VIII, Henry I. Here we go.
Portrayed by the Americans. He had a really long reign where, yes, the 13 colonies slipped away from British rule, but also Napoleon was defeated. By the end, he was plagued by severe mental illness. Yeah,
people don't talk about that. Everybody focuses so heavily, at least here in the States, on the revolution that they think George III was a bad king, and he wasn't. He was a pretty solid king. 60 years on the throne, like he said, defeated Napoleon. George III is not responsible. I mean, he obviously was in favor of the war to keep America part of the British Empire, but it was Lord North and the Parliament who really led the charge on that, and really are the ones who bungled that from the start in the response to it and everything. And George III, other than that kind of a blip, and of course his own mental illness, which he of course couldn't control, pretty solid king. George V, there we go.
To George V, a figurehead whose reign saw World War I and the rise of extremist political ideologies.
Yeah. Don't
really have anything else to say, to be honest.
Yeah, but George V, solid monarch, not a very good dad, but is on the throne for a significant amount of time, 26 years, in the aftermath of Victoria and then Edward VII. So George V comes along and I think brings some stability, brings some confidence in the monarchy after Edward VII, who was kind of a playboy and never really seemed all that. I mean, he probably had a lot more in common Edward VII did with Edward VIII, whereas George V and George VI both had that real strong sense of duty and honor about the monarchy. So there's Anne. So we're 3 for 3 on the B's. We're just going to be missing Henry I and Henry VIII and James I now.
21, Anne. A relatively short reign, mostly marked by political stuff. The most notable event was the Act of Union, which concluded the union between the crowns of England and Scotland. This is arguably where the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland began, though I can't say it for sure due to bureaucratic reasons mostly.
It's not arguably, it's legally when the United Kingdom began, was during Anne's reign. That's a point of fact.
20, Henry I. Just an overall pretty effective ruler. Great administrator, but highly disliked by the man he led over. Likely because of his rather unforgiving nature.
Yeah, but you got to remember, Henry I is coming in the relatively close aftermath of the Norman conquest. And there's still a lot of remnants of William the Conqueror, not only conquering England for the Normans, but also the way he basically put his heavy footprint on the entire country. You know, he destroyed large parts of it, rebuilt it in his image, so to speak, put castles everywhere. So Henry I is kind of a continuation of that sort of policy.
19, Henry VIII. Probably the most controversial placement. Make no mistake, this is a terrible human being, and he should have been a terrible king. He blew through the cash his father accumulated on the...
But understand that when we're talking about Henry VIII, we're talking really about 2 different reigns. His early reign, he's a handsome guy, he's athletic, he's liked, he's popular among the people. He's really they talk about the Tudor rose, which is the white rose of York and the red rose of Lancaster being merged. But he embodies that. He literally is the Tudor rose. His mother was the daughter of Edward IV, the Yorkist king. And his father was Henry VII, the Lancastrian side king. And so he literally is the child of both sides, and he brings an end to that in his own person. And he's intelligent. He's very into humanist ideals and looks for opportunities to do things other than just by war all the time. And then you get into the issue number 1 with his inability to have a son. He had sons that either died young with his wife Catherine of Aragon or were illegitimate and then died, like his child that he had with Elizabeth Blunt. But he also suffered a pretty severe jousting accident that may have left him with some brain damage, certainly left him with a wound that got infected and festered and smelled and impacted him for the rest of his life. And it seems like around the time all that went down, he becomes a different person. This is when he starts to put on the weight. This is when he wants to get rid of Catherine of Aragon for Anne Boleyn. All of this stuff happens. And so there's really kind of 2 reigns to Henry.
The treasury, he got himself involved in pointless wars, and of course, pissed off everyone for his obsession at having a son. But somehow, along the way, he made at least two major calls that ended up benefiting England in a big way. The first is the creation of his own church, which made England independent from the Catholic Church.
And remember, Henry VIII did not create a Protestant church. He considered himself a good Catholic. What he didn't like was being under the authority of a pope in Rome. He didn't think that a king should be subservient to the pope. So he really just wanted his own version of the Catholic Church that had its own authority in England.
The second is the less noticeable, but still major decision
Navy?
of founding the Royal Navy.
Yep.
And you know where that leads.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Henry VIII is like that student facing a math problem that makes all the wrong calculations, but still somehow ends up getting the right answer.
He's 100% right. I wouldn't go so far as to say he kind of lucked into it. Some of that stuff was intentional. But yeah, the Navy is a major lasting impact.
18. Edward the Confessor. Jury is still out on this one. Well, it will probably always be out. Views on him range from depicting him as a saint to an energetic and capable ruler to a disaster who destroyed royal power in Britain. I tend to see him in the more sympathetic light.
James I?
17. Harold Godwinson.
See, here's another guy who's only on the throne for months. I don't really know how we rank a guy like Harold Godwinson.
AKA the poor sod who accomplished a magnificent victory against the Norwegians in the Battle of Stamford Bridge, only to die in the Battle of Hastings against William the Conqueror, not even a month after. 16. James I.
I'm convinced now. Dude copied my answers. He did. Every single one of his tiers has been exactly the same as mine. You guys are probably sick of hearing me say it, but it continues to shock me.
The King of Scotland before becoming the King of England. He committed himself to pursuing peace and avoiding war, specifically the 30 Years' War that ravaged Europe.
And I agree. Out of my list of B tier, with Henry I, Henry VIII, James I, and George III, George V, I definitely put James at the top of that list. Really, really good monarch when he comes to the throne. He comes to the throne because his great-grandmother was Henry VIII's sister. And he was next in line because none of Henry VIII's three children who sat on the throne had any legitimate children of their own. So, my A tier now. William the Conqueror, Henry II, Henry V, William and Mary.
15. George VI.
Okay, there we go. We've got a change. All right, thankfully. I have George VI in S tier.
Born a stammerer, beats it. Comes into power with...
Wasn't born a stammerer. You aren't born with a stammer. It developed in early childhood because of trauma, most likely, that happened. And I said earlier about George V not being a great parent. Really kind of was a non-existent parent. When he was involved in his kids' lives, it was kind of as a overbearing tyrant. And I think George VI probably developed his stammer during that time.
The popularity of the monarchy at an all-time low. Chooses to stay in Buckingham Palace in World War II despite not being safe.
Yeah.
Got the same rationing restrictions as his people. Boosted morale by visits through the country. This guy represents everything a figurehead monarch should be.
100%. And listen, when I rank these monarchs, and I guess that's what he's doing too, you can't compare them to each other in terms of, okay, when George VI is monarch, the role of the monarchy is 1,000% different than when, say, Henry VIII or William the Conqueror is monarch. It's a different world. But all you can do is judge them on how they did within the system that they were a part of. In George VI's role, he did it perfectly. A guy who legit hated being in the public eye. He was a naval officer. He had served in World War I. He was at the Battle of Jutland as a turret gunner officer aboard the HMS Collingwood. Navy was where he was comfortable. It was what he enjoyed. It was what he felt most proud of, I think, other than his family. But his brother squanders everything, sticks him on the throne, and he comes in and performs brilliantly, admirably, above and beyond the call of duty at one of the darkest times in the history of his nation during World War II. And as far as I could see, did it about as well as anyone could have, despite a debilitating stammer and the things he dealt with. Absolutely one of my favorite people in all of history. I love George VI.
He's a total Chad.
Yeah.
14, Mary II. She's
See,
usually
I put William and Mary together, but that's fine.
placed alongside her husband, William III, though I am keeping them apart. In part because William III ruled for longer.
That's true.
It wasn't the same as I did with the Catholic monarchs, I know. 13. William the Conqueror. A good general for sure, but not that great of a king, specifically for England. He spent...
Though I wouldn't say then that you could put him in A tier if you don't think he's that great of a king. I think he was, as far as what he did in the role that he had, good.
more time in continental Europe than England throughout his reign. Number 12, William III.
That's because he was also Duke of Normandy, and I think at least for William the Conqueror, he considered Normandy to be the more important prize of the two. But yeah, I have William and Mary, William I, Henry II, Henry V as my A tier, so we'll see how they shape up.
Third, mostly busy with the 9 Years' War. Had to deal with the whole Jacobite thing. 11.
Yeah, and how he handled the Jacobite thing, I'm not a fan of at all. But
Edgar the Peaceful. Consolidated on the political union achieved by his predecessors. Sometimes you just need a guy like that. 10. Alfred the Great.
Alfred.
Though the title wasn't given until centuries after his death, it's not exactly given without reason.
But he also wasn't king of England because England didn't exist yet. He was king of Wessex.
Basically, there was nothing this guy couldn't do.
Yeah.
Administration, taxation, legal reforms, military reforms, education, management. This guy had it all. The first king of England, arguably.
He wasn't, though, but he wanted to be. I think his grandson was the first king of England, but he did a lot of the groundwork that made England possible, and it was a dream he had. The person that I think of a lot when I think of Alfred the Great is the Emperor Augustus for Rome, the first emperor of Rome. Physically kind of weak and sickly at times, but intellectual giant. Smarter than everybody else in the room, 3 steps ahead of everybody else in the room intellectually, and that's the kind of person you need to establish an empire or establish a kingdom. Alfred the Great is absolutely one of my favorite people in history, and I think at some point we need to dive into his story a little bit more. Henry V and then Henry II, and we'll have my A tier wrapped off.
9. Henry V. Also known as the guy who came very close to conquering France in the 100 Years' War.
He did conquer France. He died, and it all got lost after his death.
The most notable of his victories was,
Agincourt.
of course, the Battle of Agincourt, where he managed a decisive victory despite being heavily outnumbered. 8.
Yeah, so Henry V, obviously, people know him for Agincourt, for that great victory where they basically wiped out the nobility of France in an afternoon. I'd like to get to that battlefield at some point. There's not a lot to see, but it's still a fascinating battle. Brilliant tactics for the English to kind of even the odds there against a far superior force for the French. And it leads a few years later to him actually taking the throne of France away from the French. The King of France, who was himself dealing with some major mental health issues, names Henry V as his heir. And then they both die, and Henry VI inherits both thrones, in name at least.
Canute the Great. Made laws,
Canute.
strengthened currency, was a great politician, and successfully protected England against Viking raids, which, given the fact he was also king of Norway and Denmark, was actually pretty easy for him. 7. Athelstan. Arguably the first king of England. Again.
Yep.
He essentially built upon what Alfred the Great had accomplished. More legal texts have survived to this day from his reign than any other 10th century English king. 6. Henry II.
There you go.
Or Henry Curtmantle. Widely regarded as one of the greatest English kings to have ever lived. Some people will actually consider him as number 1. There's only
I wouldn't put him number 1, but I would put him at the top of my A tier.
2 reasons why he isn't higher. The first being his reign wasn't exactly smooth sailing, and he even had to humiliate himself in front of the English people due to the death of Thomas Becket.
So that's a fascinating story. Thomas Becket was one of his best friends, and Henry was dealing with a major issue of conflict over authority, over the King of England's authority over the members of the clergy. The clergy basically had their own legal system. If a clergyman killed somebody, they weren't tried in an English court, they were tried by a church court. And Henry hated the fact that he couldn't exert his power over the clergy. And so what does he do? He basically manages his way into getting his buddy made the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he gets the Pope to sign off on it, thinking now he's got a friend and an ally as head of the church in England. But what he didn't expect was that Thomas Becket would actually take his role seriously. We talked about this when we were talking about Napoleon's marshals, about how Napoleon, one of his marshals, gets taken to Sweden and put in charge of the monarchy there. And Napoleon thinks he's got a buddy in Sweden, but no, the King of Sweden's going to do what's best for the Kingdom of Sweden. And he takes that role seriously, Bernadotte does. And the same thing happens with Thomas Becket. He becomes a thorn in Henry's side. And Henry makes some offhand comment when he hears about something that Becket did. Some people have said that he said something about, will no one rid me of this turbulent priest? There's other versions of what he said, but whatever he said, some knights who were in his presence and heard it took it as a order to go kill Thomas Becket. And they do. They go and they basically hack his head off and scatter his brains on the floor of Canterbury Cathedral. And this is such a PR disaster for Henry that he has to come and basically prostrate himself before the people. He allows himself to be flogged. He lays on the floor for like a day or something. But it works. It's brilliant PR. It's brilliant theater on the part of Henry II, and it shows his political acumen. And we talked earlier about monarchs who didn't know how to read the room. Henry II really knew how to read the room, and he hit all the right notes in how he responded to what happened with Thomas Becket.
The other reason being, as an outsider myself, his reign just lacks the oomph the people higher than him have. 5, Victoria. So big of a figure, a literal era is named after her.
So he had George VI in A tier, so that's the one difference. I have George S tier, but I'm comfortable with that. He doesn't rank Elizabeth II, but I've got her in S tier, so then I'm guessing that his top 5 have to be Victoria, Elizabeth I, Edward III, and Edward I. Victoria, Elizabeth I, Edward III, and yeah, must
the
be one
grandmother
more.
of Europe, her reign saw, arguably, the height of the British Empire. Number 4, Edward Longshanks.
Yeah.
Longshanks means long legs, in
Yep,
case you're wondering.
he was tall.
Yeah,
6'2".
he was 6'2", which is already pretty tall today.
And we know that for sure because he was exhumed at one point. Well, not really exhumed. His tomb was opened and they measured him.
For the standards of the Middle Age, dude was freaking gigantic.
Yeah.
His legislative accomplishments have made him considered to be the English Justinian, though he's criticized for his inability to compromise.
Yeah, but he, solid king. He, obviously everybody remembers him for the whole Braveheart debacle with William Wallace, even though he wasn't really Braveheart. But he's right on his tomb at Westminster Abbey, Edward I. It says, Hammer of the Scots in Latin. Was it anyway, it's Scotorum, Malleum Scotorum, something like that. But one of the best, but I think his grandson Edward III was even better.
3, Edward the Elder. The successor of Alfred the Great, he destroyed the power of the Vikings in southern England, all the while laying the groundwork for a strong English kingdom. Ironically, Edward was often overshadowed by Alfred the Great until the late 20th century. 2, Edward III. With an incredible 50-year-long reign, Edward III is most famous for starting the 100 Years' War. The first phase went pretty well. By the end, not so much. In his defense, he did have to deal with the Black Death, and maybe it's just me, but I always get the feeling the degree of devastation major plagues leave isn't given enough significance.
100%, because it's not just about how many people die. It's about how many people die and what jobs they did. Imagine if a third to one half of our entire population died in the next year. What would that do to our infrastructure, to our economy? You know, your teachers are all dying. Your farmers are all dying. The people running the electric department are all dying. The people running the government are all dying. There are gaping vacuums of of work in every sector, and it took generations to recover from that. And yet, despite all of that, he's fighting a decades-long war against the French because he's got a very strong claim to the French throne, and by and large does it all really, really well. He creates not only the Order of the Garter, which is like the top order of chivalry in England to this day. He also creates the system of royal dukes, which you could argue laid the groundwork for the 100 Years' War, or not, for the Wars of the Roses, because what he did was he made his sons all the most powerful landowners and military leaders in the country, and that inevitably created much stronger rivalries that led directly to his grandsons, Richard II and Henry IV, fighting over the throne because that power was there. And it led to continued issues with that down the road.
One, Elizabeth. Yeah, I think it's a pretty obvious
I won't
choice.
argue with that.
It's ironic she's seen as the big slayer of the Catholic evil when, in fact, she was actually pretty cautious and tried her best at avoiding a major war.
Yeah, she was all about tolerance. She was all about, I'm a Protestant, but every person has the right to worship within his or her own conscience.
Likewise, being the symbol of Protestantism, she actually had a pretty moderate view on religion.
She did.
In the big picture, her reign turned England into a major power, and in turn she had made herself an essential figure in the English mythos.
There's no monarch that I can think of in the history that we just talked about where you can see such a marked strengthening from beginning to end like you can with Elizabeth. And that's why I think I agree with him that she's probably deserves to be first. England when she comes to the throne versus England when she leaves the throne to her cousin James I. Marked strengthening. Incredible movement toward the great Britannia that we know in the centuries to come after that. So, with one exception, George VI, and that might be a little bit of an emotional ranking on my part because I like him so much. Every one of his rankings was in the exact same tier that I put mine. So, I'm going to chalk that up to us just being of the same mind and both really having our finger on the pulse of what's right, and not on the fact that he watched my video first. So there's no reason for me to think that that's the case or that he even knew about my video. So let me know your thoughts. What do you think? What did we get right? What did we get wrong? What would you change from the rankings that we talked about? Always an interesting topic. I love talking about it, and I'm going to be visiting the graves of a lot of these folks at Westminster Abbey in just a couple of weeks. Pretty excited about that. Thanks for watching.